Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, delegates. My name is Mary Beaton, and it's my pleasure as the BERA Conference and Events Committee Chair to welcome you to the BERA Annual Conference 2021. We're delighted to be welcoming so many of you from around the world, and we hope you'll find the next few days really enjoyable. A few thank yous before we begin the conference. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for submitting your abstracts and now attending conference. I'd like to thank you for those of you who engaged in the reviewing process, which is such an important part of conference preparation. And speaking of conference preparation, I'd like to thank two groups of people who've been instrumental in leading up to the conference and contributing to the success that I know it's going to be. First, I'd like to thank my colleagues on the Conference and Events Committee. As you can imagine, there were many decisions that had to be made as we engaged in our first virtual conference. And I'd like to thank each and every one of them for their time and energy. I'd also like to thank the BERA office team for their hard work and commitment in preparing this year, and a special word of thanks to Dior Webb and Mette Nielsen, who have worked some very long hours in the last few weeks in preparation for the conference. So conference will be a little bit different this year for those of you who regularly attend face-to-face, but we hope that the platform, which was chosen after very much thought, will be easy to navigate. On the platform agenda, which you use to access this session, you'll be able to find and view all the live sessions, and you'll be able to filter the agenda by special interest groups so that you can prioritize the sessions that you want to listen to first. You'll also find resources, including documents and on-demand videos, and new sets of individual papers will be released each day at 5:30 British Summer Time, and then the recordings will be available until the end of the month. One element I know is valued by delegates is the opportunity to network with others. And with that in mind, we've chosen a platform that facilitates engagement from both delegates and speakers in a number of different ways. You can join in the conversation with live Q&As, starting with our first keynote, Katy Vigurs, following this session. You can visit the sponsor booths and interact with their representatives, vote for your preferred posters, and network with other delegates via chat or one-to-one calls. You can take the participants matching form to connect with like-minded peers, new people you might not have met before, and leave messages for other delegates on the special interest group message boards. And of course, please don't forget to tweet throughout the event using the hashtag BERA2021. Of course, the annual conference is a highlight of the year for BERA. But BERA as an organisation is active throughout the year, supporting the work of its members. Please do visit the BERA membership booth, where you can find more information about those activities. And I'm going to hand over just now to our current president, Professor Dominic Wise, who'll explain a little bit more about the year-round activity of BERA.
Laurie, thank you so much, and thanks also to your work, in addition to everyone else you've thanked. Well, this seems to me like a momentous moment. After all we've been through, you people watching us today are a massive testament to the excitement that we all have for education, education research, education practice, education policy. We are the heart and soul of education research policy practice. And it's why I am absolutely delighted that over 900 people will be joining us this week. And I'm as aware as all you are that the digital environment is not the same as the personal and the social environment that we enjoy. Fingers crossed, those moments are coming back, and we're already planning, as it happens, for next year's conference in Liverpool. Anyway, 900 people, terrific. We've got 100 live sessions. We've got 400 individual papers and posters, an extraordinary richness of intellectual excellence. And all of this, of course, as Mari was saying, fits with our ambitious series of online events that have been going on for the last 18 months. And by the way, I remember when I was chair of the conference committee and then Vari took over, we discussed at length the possibility, would we be able to hold a digital seminar? And sure enough, we did, and I was privileged to work with colleagues on one on curriculum as it happened. But the whole annual conference is much more ambitious and so terrific. We've had such a good start and so much interest. The online events then over the past 18 months have also, well, there have been 50, 5,000 people have registered for these. 2,500 have viewed them afterwards, and that is a massive advantage of the digital world, isn't it? That you can access them through the BERA website. And although, of course, the pandemic has disrupted our work, in some ways, BERA has been even more active than ever, and we've continued to innovate. So, for example, we've funded 14 small research grants, totaling almost £60,000, all about the impact of COVID. Our blog series on the pandemic now has over 700 entries. And if I go on further about our publications, so both the British Educational Research Journal and the British Journal of Education Technology, two of BERA's suite of journals, saw increases in their impact factor. BJET is now being ranked second globally out of the generic education technology journals. Terrific success. Praise to the editors, to the reviewers, to the board, and of course to you, the writers. We have our special magazine for BERA members, Research Intelligence, and that continues to publish 4 times a year for BERA members only currently. The blog is another terrific success. It's on the verge of its 1,000th post. It has over 170,000 unique page views in the past 12 months alone. And if the pandemic is something that has caused us all to think, to research, then perhaps something that should have come to our minds many, many years ago, and by our minds, I mean the world's minds, it's the issue of climate change and sustainability. BERA has already published 3 briefings from our new research commission, and they have their launch event ahead of the COP summit on the 1st of November. I'm sure that work will be terrifically important because education, of course, has a huge part to play in the issues of climate change and sustainability, and many of us, our work is directly with children and young people, and so it's particularly important to us. Another area where we've innovated, we've challenged ourselves, we've built on what we've managed to achieve previously, but know we have to do more, is on the issues of equality, diversity in relation to BERA's work. With a great deal of rigorous attention to statistics and valid information, we developed an action plan, and we now have clear targets, and we will report annually against our targets on equality and diversity within BERA. And that has led to us increasing representation at all levels of our organisation. Also, given we are a research organisation, we will soon announce £40,000 of funding for research on race and ethnicity through our next round of small grants and also the curriculum investigation grant. Another area where we're innovating, pushing forward, but also building on our 50-year history. We are at the beginning of a significant project, or perhaps I should say a series of linked projects that we're calling the State of the Discipline projects. So it's all about education as an academic discipline, and also the way that education links with research, theory, practice, and policy. Next week, we published the first report from this. The team won a competitive tender to carry out a systematic review of relevant literature. We're also going to be publishing 3 new tenders, so look out for these. If you're interested in undertaking some research work for BERA, then look out for these new tenders, which of course, as usual, will be peer reviewed, and so they're competitive opportunities. The first one is a survey of education researchers' perceptions of their work and their identities in relation to education research in universities in the United Kingdom. I suspect that will be a very important study, and it's one that, all goes well, we hope to repeat in future years. We're also going to commission an update to what's called the BERA Observatory, which we first published back in 2014. So there's another opportunity there. And we want to undertake a study of equality and diversity in university education departments. So in addition to all the regular opportunities that you have as a BERA member, these are brand new. And so this is just the way BERA is hardwired for innovation forever. And so I'm going to conclude just by celebrating something that's really important. I want to thank every single one of you listening, and I want to thank everyone who joins us through the week, and all those people who've been with us for many years. But this is about new people as well. We've achieved a record membership of BERA in 2021. What a staggering thing to achieve given the context. And I cannot heap enough praise on the BERA office staff who work in such a professional way. We've got more than 2,700 members, which I think makes us the third biggest education research organisation in the world. And we have 500 teacher members among our membership. And that's a clear statement that we really do value and want to engage with our practitioner members, including our people with policy interests, even though we're driven by research, all of us. So thank you to all those who are members and who've engaged. By the way, the 2022 membership year is now open. So here is my little advert. If you're not a member, I hope I've whetted your appetite so that you might join now and get the rest of 2021 costs included in your new membership, as well as the whole of 2022. So I think coming back to some of the issues to do with sustainability, equality, equity, and frankly, just making sure that our discipline, education is our discipline, we own it and we want it to grow and strengthen. That's all the more reason to come and be part of the community, join BERA, and if you want, please do get involved with work on BERA Council and so on. And by the way, I've made some observations about involvement in BERA in this month's Research Intelligence in my page, from the President. So wonderful, can't wait to hear about all the conversations.
Thanks very much, Dominic. And now we move on to our first keynote. A couple of minutes ahead, but hopefully folk are joining us now. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the conference. Katy is a long-term member of BERA, I believe since 2001. She received a Meeting of Minds Fellowship in 2012 from BERA and was also elected co-convener of the BERA Social Justice SIG with Dr. Ruth Boyask between 2012 and 2016. So it gives a particular pleasure to welcome such a seasoned member of BERA to be our first keynote today. Katy specialises in narrative, visual and participative research methods and has expertise in creative pathways in public engagement. I'm going to make special mention of her work with cartoon and comic arts undergraduate students to create a research-informed comic on the impact of student finance reforms, which I felt was particularly groundbreaking work. Katy is a critical higher education researcher with particular interest in the stratification of higher education, its relationship to university access, student experience, and graduate outcomes. She's passionate about the experiences and outcomes of postgraduate researchers and early career researchers. And I think I speak for all of us, no matter what stage of career we're at, that the future of our discipline lies in the hands of our postgraduate researchers and early career researchers. And therefore it's with great pleasure that I note that the title of her keynote is Careering Through Educational Research, Problematising What It Means to be an Early Career Researcher in Education and Why This Matters. Just one small piece of housekeeping before I hand over to Katy. Please do submit your questions as Katy is speaking. We're going to try and answer as many as possible of them in the time allowed. And I would ask you particularly to make them as succinct as possible. You're slightly more likely to get your question answered if it's succinct. And so it gives me great pleasure to hand over now to Katy.
Hello, everyone. Right, let's do this. First of all, I want to say that I'm really glad to be here today, although it does feel a bit strange being alone at my computer in the spare room. And I think I never thought I'd say this, but I actually miss making eye contact with people. I miss reading the room, feeling the atmosphere, and even hearing your coughs and murmurs. I find these online keynotes a little bizarre and disembodied. So I want to begin by genuinely asking how you all are, because it's been such an unprecedented and unpredictable time over the last 18 months. And I'm aware that the pandemic has taken and continues to take its toll on us in many significant ways. And that's before we even start thinking about the uncertainty and challenges facing almost all sectors of education right now. So far, so gloomy. More of that to come. Now, let me take you back to the summer of 2019, where I just started a new job at Birmingham City University. I was also heavily pregnant and about to go on maternity leave when I received an invitation from BERA to give the 2020 keynote lecture for early career researchers, or ECRs, as I'll say from now on. In terms of the brief, I was simply asked to prepare something that would be of interest to ECRs, and we'll come back to that in a minute. I said yes straight away, but of course the global pandemic meant there was no BERA conference in 2020. So in some senses, this presentation has been a long time in the making. And in this time, I've been reflecting quite a bit on my own 20-year relationship with BERA, as Mari mentioned. Back in September 2001, I was about to start a full-time PhD scholarship, and my supervisors suggested, and this was before I even started the PhD, they suggested I join BERA. Back then, there was no social media, no smartphones, no Wi-Fi, and no online events. And looking back, I would describe it as a much quieter, less connected time for new doctoral researchers. I had no idea what other researchers in my field looked like or sounded like. And I think this is one of the reasons that the annual BERA conference was so important to me as a new researcher. Attending my first conference, which was in Exeter in 2002, I think, it made me feel that the educational research community was very much embodied, alive, vibrant. For me, it provided an exciting and rich learning environment, but it did something else too, something that remains vital to the richness of my working life today. What happened at my first BERA conference was that I started to recognise the same faces in the audiences of the sessions that I was attending. And initially, this led to some embarrassed nods of acknowledgement and scribbling down from their names from the badges in my notebook. And what I now realise was happening was the slow and steady incremental development of a network, a community, which remains the supportive backbone to my research journey and my researcher identity today. So I'll always be grateful to BERA for creating the conditions, especially early in my research journey, that allowed such professional relationships and collectives to organically develop, and that have stood the test of time through my career so far. Don't think it's letting me move on. Let me just, there we go. Anyway, let's go back to the brief for the keynote. Prepare something that would be of interest to ECRs. This got me thinking primarily about the concept and category of the early career researcher. I started to pick away at the concept and some of the assumptions that lie behind the term, and this generated a series of questions, such as, what concept of career is signalled when we talk about early career researchers? What normative discourses of research careers exist? How is the ideal ECR subject imagined? What is it like to be an ECR? What are their experiences? And what does it mean to be an ECR in the discipline of education? And does this need problematizing? I also spent time thinking about the broad educational backgrounds, interests, and futures of the BERA audience. And it feels only right at this point to mention the BERA ECR network. I think you can see the group's Twitter handle at the top of the screen. The ECR network supports BERA members who are completing their master's or doctorate in education, as well as those who've completed their studies in the past 5 years. It supports those who are pursuing careers as researchers in HE and also practitioners seeking to undertake educational research. And I really like that it's explicit about supporting practitioners and close to practice research. I noticed on Twitter over the summer that the ECR network, together with the BERA HE SIG, launched an online survey that aims to problematise the ECR experience. And on the back of this, there's going to be a conference workshop at 2 p.m. this Wednesday. And that aims to hold a conversation about reimagining the ECR experience. The session is open to all, so please do go along if you can, and I certainly intend to be there. I also noticed that BERA has just launched a new ECR Career Development Fellowship with two funds of £2,000, which are particularly aimed at those on insecure and precarious contracts. And again, I think this is a positive step by BERA. Now, in preparation for this talk, I've reflected a lot on my own past experiences as a PhD student and my early years of becoming a researcher and an academic. I've also read a lot, which you'll see I've turned into a long list of further reading at the end of the presentation. I'll admit now that doing the reading for this keynote and putting the presentation together has been an unsettling, uncomfortable, and sometimes sobering process. At times, much of what I've learned has made me feel angry, powerless, and even complicit. So I've also deliberately tried to seek out work that provides glimmers of hope and cracks of light. I really hope this talk is of interest to those of you who are newer educational researchers. But I also think it's crucial that everyone involved in educational research at whatever stage of the career course be engaged with and challenged by the debates and issues that we're now going to explore. Okay, I think I'm getting the hang of it now. Okay, I want to begin by telling you something about where I'm coming from. I find myself working in universities through interests in and commitments to understanding and challenging educational inequalities. And for me, the most important aspects of my job are teaching and research that relate to such social injustices. I identify as a feminist who's engaged in critical pedagogy and critical higher education research. So I'm very aware of how the inequalities of gender, race, and social class interact with other categories like age, disability, migration status, and sexuality to produce different experiences of inclusion and exclusion in HE. As I've already mentioned, today I'll be drawing on some short reflections that are grounded within the singularities of my own experience, and yet, from my many informal conversations with friends and colleagues across multiple universities, I'm aware that these reflections will resonate beyond my narrative. I've also sought out published research that privileges the voices of ECRs talking about their wider lives, as well as their paid work and job roles. In many ways, it feels misleading that there is only me giving this keynote, as what I'm presenting is built on the extensive scholarship of many colleagues across the world, many of whom are BERA members, past and present. So now let's think about this concept of career. What do we mean when we talk about career? Traditionally, it's used to refer to paid work with a focus on progress within a profession. The American sociologist Harold Walensky described career as a succession of related jobs arranged in a hierarchy of prestige, through which a person moves in an ordered, more or less predictable sequence. Now, this definition is 60 years old, but it still resonates with how many people and organisations think about career today, and that includes higher education institutions. So the notion of career in this traditional sense is seen as work-centric, linear, and dependent on rational decision-making by the individual, with limited consideration of the social and political dimensions to career. This means it usually ignores the context and constraints within which individuals build their lives and careers. Tristram Hooley argues that neoliberal structures and cultures have transformed the potentially emancipatory promise of career, where you determine what you do with your life, into a process defined by individualism, competition, insecurity, and oppression. The trouble with an excessive focus on individual agency in terms of career is that it runs the risk of responsibilizing individuals and blaming them for structural failings. Although structuralist perspectives of career on their own can create a sense of fatalism and powerlessness. So you've probably guessed by now that I'm going to try to critique normative discourses of career in HE. This is not to ignore that there are many positive aspects of being an educational researcher or academic. Academic work is often stimulating and rewarding, varied and interesting, and offers some level of autonomy. But as the Res Sisters collective points out, anger and resistance is often prefaced by a disclaimer about academia as a privileged space, which I agree it is, but that does not make it an equal and equitable space. So now let's look at an alternative definition of career. Tristram Hooley and colleagues describe career in broader terms as our path through life, learning, and work, and as the intersections between our individual selves and the institutions of the social world. Here, career is not just understood as an expression of our personal will, but as embedded in social structures. They argue that career can be thought of as a lifetime project, not just about your paid work or hierarchical progression, but as a thread that runs through your life, joining your paid work with your unpaid work, education, family time, leisure, citizenship, and everything else. And I wonder what our careers could look like when thought of in these broader terms. I also want to think about the relational aspects of career, recognising that our lives and work are also intertwined with others' lives and work. As Erin Manning reminds us, relation is actually what our worlds are made of. So I found Joe Littler's work very helpful in understanding meritocracy as an ideological discourse, and using this to think about what it looks like and what it produces in HE. She describes competitive, linear, hierarchical systems in which, by definition, some people must be left behind. Neoliberal meritocracy offers the false promise that the social ladder is consistent and there for all of us, as long as we work hard and have enough nous and gumption to climb, which sounds a bit like the normative career pathway in HE. However, contemporary academia is often positioned as progressive and inclusive. The appearance of non-traditional subjects in HE, and that goes for students and staff, is often celebrated as a symbol of meritocracy and a ticket to upward social mobility. But academia is not a level playing field. And as the Res Sisters describe, there is little space for experiences of marginalisation in HE to be spoken about beyond personal emails or hushed conversations at conferences. We need to contest and challenge the meritocratic rhetoric of the academic career course. we need to problematize linear understandings of becoming an educational researcher. So where do we go from here? Building on the work of critical researchers like Maddie Breeze, Karen Gravitt, Catherine Manathunga, Nicola Rollock, Yvette Taylor, and the Res Sisters, to name only a few, the aim of this talk is to challenge such normative and meritocratic discourses of careering in research. And at this point, I want to speak to the double meaning of the word careering used in this session's title. The term careering could refer to, on the one hand, frantic and frenetic, out-of-control efforts towards career mobility, as well as meaning, on the other hand, an individual strategy to navigate the pressurized and competitive career framework. Homogeneous and linear narratives of careering for ECRs need to be unsettled. As we will move on to see, research suggests that ECR pathways and experiences are far from equal or equitable. Okay, so let me share with you the front page of my current CV. I've been thinking a lot about how CVs are creatively curated for different audiences and about the stories they do and do not tell. Now, presented like this, in many senses, my CV is an example of a superficially normative HE career. It looks like I carved out a smooth, linear trajectory once I'd completed my PhD, moving in an upward fashion through the posts of research fellow, lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, and reader. And an academic interview panel would likely perceive that I've made my way through the academic career course in an ordered and predictable sequence. And based on this demonstrable path, they would also probably think that they know what my next career move might be or should be. But if they were to scrutinise my CV, if they looked closely, they may also make observations such as, she took a long time to complete her PhD, which is true, and that's a story for another time. She's only worked at newer post-92 universities, and perhaps her profile does look quite regional. And they may start to question the extent to which I meet the criteria of the ideal academic subject and the extent to which I'd be a good fit with their institution. I will come back to my CV later to explore some of the more invisible, unspoken career narratives contained within it. So the traditional imagined ECR is frequently thought of as being young, middle class, not disabled, mobile, meaning that they're free from ties to people and place, and implicitly white and male. And there are expectations of this imagined ECR. If they are to be identified as a rising academic star or a future research leader, then they must win research funding, achieve impact, satisfy students, and impress peers through high-ranking international publications. The problem is that this construction of the ideal ECR and the achievements that are expected become a sort of benchmark with which to judge the progress and success of all ECRs. And this idea of the ideal ECR is also traceable through institutional policies and resources, which say they aim to support the career development of all ECRs, but actually cater for a minority, and usually a privileged minority at that. As Sarah Hughes wrote recently, the employment experiences of ECRs are well documented. Short-term contracts, hourly paid work, the expectation of institutional mobility, heavy teaching loads, poor pay, and a lack of career support. And if possible, the Res Sisters paint an even bleaker picture. They write that it feels as though ECRs are particularly punished by the shift towards commodification, by which they mean productivity and outputs. They say, we're trying to establish careers in an arena where competitive individualism is valued, where people spend years trying to land secure contracts, many writing in their spare unpaid time to enhance their prospects. we are being crushed by the very career we know should be liberating. We find ourselves forced to work in circumstances that are not of our making, in a system that we are simultaneously critiquing and reproducing. We are expected to cope with the spiralling demands of the job, not to question them. To critique feels like admitting that we are struggling, we are not up to the job, that we are simply not good enough or tough enough. And even when institutions acknowledge the stress and anxiety associated with academic work, the solutions offered are a set of individualised tools by which to cope with the strains of the neoliberal university. As Carol Leithwood and Barbara Reid note, for those researchers who are marginalised in HE, and especially those who occupy the most precarious academic positions, contesting the demands and inequalities of higher education can be risky work. We're now going to consider a range of inequalities that are experienced by many ECRs in a bid to further unsettle the idea of the smooth, homogeneous research career. So let us take a moment to think about career progression for Black female researchers in the UK. In 2019, there were only 25 Black female professors working in UK universities, and that's across all subjects and disciplines. Nicola Rollock's research for UCU interviewed 20 of these 25 professors, and her report reveals a system-wide culture in which the route to professorship is challenging, lacks transparency and fairness, and in which only certain forms of knowledge and achievement are valued. Delays in career progression were common and caused by others' attempts to undermine, stereotype, and limit the opportunity available, as well as a pervasive culture of passive bullying. And as Nirmal Puwar's work reminds us, some academics are made to feel that they are outsiders, marked as bodies out of place, as space invaders. And in terms of delays to career progression, Maddie Breeze and Yvette Taylor highlight how career roadblocks are unevenly distributed in academia. And they ask us to pay attention to whose career dead ends are inscribed as sticky deficiencies of the self, embodied as classed, raced, and gendered career failures. Being informally advised to wait for a permanent contract before trying to have a baby is guidance that's frequently given to female ECRs. Sarah Hughes writes that this is grounded with problematic assumptions. First, that ECRs will arrive at a permanent job in the future if they persist with the present. And second, that their fertility or infertility is known to them, and that they are able to and will make a rational decision to conceive a child. She points out that these are pervasive assumptions with deeply personal implications. She also writes about pressures on female researchers to remain academically active while on maternity leave. Researchers Inoa Matoya and Marta Perez also caution that unstable labour conditions can make slowing down the rhythm of academic production a risky possibility for ECRs who wish to pursue an academic career. And actually, this isn't limited to ECRs. I also received similar advice in 2019. I was told in a friendly aside by another female academic that it's important not to become irrelevant while I'm off on maternity leave. She said, "You'll be surprised how quickly you'll be forgotten if you're not visible. Can't you write a paper while you're off?" And I can remember feeling rising panic as she was talking. Normalising this narrative risks reinscribing this view onto others, that there is a need to keep up with expectations of career progression or indeed to exceed them during maternity leave. But of course, being able to do that depends on so many things. And as Maddie Breeze and Yvette Taylor importantly remind us, we need to remember that not everyone shares heteronormative cares. Other cares can be brushed under the academic carpet, and those without normative caring responsibilities can find themselves called upon to enable others' normative cares, such as maternity leave, which goes back to the relational nature of career. Within the UK, HESA data for 2017-18 showed that 67% of all research jobs are insecure, and a recent report on the impacts of casualisation in the UK, in UKAG, noted that 83% of survey respondents agreed that their contractual status made it hard to plan hard to make long-term financial commitments, such as buying a house or planning for a family. There is a risk that insecure academic work becomes framed as a rite of passage for ECRs, reproducing the myth that those who successfully ride out and survive the instability will be rewarded with a stable contract. But as Sarah Hughes points out, the implications of this can exclude anyone who lacks a middle-class safety net, as well as those with caring responsibilities, health issues, and visa restrictions. So ECRs from around the world have been sharing their experiences of life and work on Twitter, and I want to share a couple of these voices with you. The first is from April of this year. She's based in the US and talks about tenure track and tenured faculty as those with secure academic contracts and career pathways. She describes herself as contingent faculty and the need to be continuously and internationally mobile to secure academic work. She wonders how she will continue building a life for herself when she doesn't know what state or country she'll be living in next year. And she ends by saying, "I need every tenured faculty member to understand that the difference between you and me is about more than just salary disparity. Being contingent faculty robs us of adulthood, not just as scholars, but as human beings." She also talks about academic careers as unequally relational, saying that the work of contingent faculty enables tenured faculty to write the books that win the awards. And she asks what those of us on permanent contracts are going to do about it. This echoes the UCU report from last year on the effects of casualised academic labour in the UK, illustrating how pain is felt and internalised by many colleagues on insecure contracts. Research participants talked about feeling stressed, underpaid, and often pushed to the brink by faculties and departments relying on goodwill and a culture of fear. They described feeling invisible to other colleagues and being treated as second-class academic citizens. The report makes it clear that this is a structural issue in which all academics are implicated, in that casualised staff are often used to ease the workloads and further the careers of permanent staff. Now, this ECR voice is from May of this year. She has recently attained a permanent contract and has been reflecting on the emotional toll of years of academic precarity and its impact on her mental health. She talks about struggling to move beyond the hypervigilance, workaholism, perfectionism, fear and anxiety that came with those insecure contracts. She talks about the broken university system. It made me wonder, what support is she getting with this transition between insecure and permanent posts? Is it even recognised as an issue requiring action by her institution, as it doesn't appear so? So now let's think about temporal equity in HE, and specifically about inequalities in ECR's timescapes. As has already been alluded to, the contemporary university privileges speed, precarity, competition, and performativity, and it operates through modes of accelerationism, work intensification, and productivity. But we need universities to acknowledge the differing rhythms of the everyday that shape the varied lived experience of ECR timescapes. And this involves recognising that the ways ECRs experience time in higher education will often be shaped by their gender, class, race, and relationships to power. I should point out that Catherine Manathunga's work explicitly refers to inequitable doctoral timescapes. But for me, her analysis and findings also resonate strongly with how ECRs experience temporal equity. She explains that hegemonic neoliberal agendas of efficiency, profitability, and managerialism mean that time is often measured in ways that fail to acknowledge how time is experienced differently by researchers from diverse backgrounds. And she argues for a reconceptualization of rigid HE timescapes in order to create space for individuals' epistemic, lived and eternal temporal rhythms, which is something we might want to think about in relation to ECRs too, and I'll try to come back to this at the end of the keynote. So I now want to draw on a recent paper by Bruce McFarlane and Alison Jefferson to talk about ECRs and intersectional disadvantage. The authors state that while there is growing discussion about equality, diversity, and inclusion in universities, much of this debate centres on conventional and singular forms of disadvantage, such as race, gender, and social class. Their argument is that disadvantage needs to be understood more holistically in terms of the intersectionality of all forms of discrimination, and specifically the effects of what they call guild power academics, and how this overlaps with other forms of inequality. They suggest that this needs to be understood as a key element of disadvantage in everyday academic life. Guild route academics are those who followed a privileged linear path into HE and are usually found in elite, research-intensive universities, such as the Russell Group in the UK. It refers to those researchers who have moved smoothly from prestigious, usually full-time PhD scholarships, through to conventional early career positions, such as that of the postdoctoral fellow. So far, this sounds rather like the imagined ECR subject that we referred to earlier. The paper contends that ECR guild route academics are often seen as victims of unfairness and inequality based on measures such as gender and caring responsibilities, as well as the prevalence of insecure fixed-term contracts. But the authors say that this ignores that this group enjoys many inbuilt advantages. In contrast, non-guild route academics are described as usually entering HE later in their career from the professions or industry, and often without a PhD. Non-guild academics may find that on entering HE, they are lower in the hierarchy and that their existing capital holds little value in their new academic field. So this brings us on to the issue of stratification in HE. The stratification of universities structures differential access to both resources and reputational recognition. As we've already said, higher education is not a level playing field, and I want to share with you the first time I realised that I was an ECR in a stratified system. So this is an excerpt from my PhD research diary from 2003. Today, after presenting some of my research in a staff seminar, a senior female academic came up to me in the coffee break and said she felt the need to warn me that my PhD would be worth less than others in the academic job market. I asked her what she meant, and she said, well, you know, you're doing it here, meaning a post-92 university, and you don't have an ESRC scholarship or things like that. These things matter out there. Up until that point, I hadn't even considered that my work and value as a researcher would be judged as lacking or deficient in some HE contexts. It was a bit of a shock, if I'm honest. Initially, I was angry at the academic who said this to me. It felt cruel, inappropriate, offensive even. But now I realise that my anger should be directed at the structures and cultures of the neoliberal university that underpinned this academic's warning to me. In a way, she was merely stating that I wasn't a guild route researcher and that this would likely be a career roadblock if I ever had aspirations of working in a research-intensive university. So this brings me back to my CV and the career stories that it doesn't tell. You've all probably heard of the concept of the shadow CV. This is where researchers share all the academic activities that they failed at, including unsuccessful grant applications, rejected research papers, and unsuccessful job interviews. Sharing shadow CVs can be seen as one approach to unsettling smooth, linear, coherent accounts of academic career progression, although it probably still perpetuates the unhelpful narrative of manic productivity. So I'm not going to share my shadow CV in that sense, but I do want to acknowledge aspects of privilege and also aspects of disadvantage. In terms of privilege, we can't ignore that I'm white, middle class, and a cisgender woman. I'm also aware of other privileges, such as having British citizenship, owning my own home, and having access to parental leave. But my CV also makes no mention of being a single parent with a 9-month-old baby in 2001 when I started my PhD. It is silent about needing to remain regional because I live around the corner from my family and I rely on these networks for moral support as well as childcare. It says nothing of my ADHD and the everyday impact this has on me and my work, which is sometimes really positive, but sometimes rather challenging. And it doesn't declare that I currently work part-time to be able to look after my toddler 2 days a week. It is also quiet about currently needing to support a terminally ill parent. And it doesn't allude to having any interests or passions outside of HE, such as my role as a humanist funeral celebrant. And it also doesn't reference the sustaining collaborative networks and friendships that BERA has enabled, which have allowed hierarchies to be flattened and the rules of the academic game to be critiqued and shared. If we apply the alternative, broader understanding of career, that of a lifetime project through life, learning and work, then my academic CV tells only a partial, highly edited career narrative, which is currently the expected norm in HE. Up to now, we've been talking about ECRs in HE in general, but who are the ECRs in the discipline of education? Suzanne Gannon and colleagues write about themselves as having been unruly doctoral students, by which they mean women with families and other obligations who already had established full-time careers and professional identities, and who were older than the standard profile of the young, bright graduate student who is automatically directed towards the tenure track academic pathway. And this profile resonates with many ECRs in education, especially those studying part-time PhDs and professional doctorates. And I'm also very aware that not all ECRs in education work in universities. They are also based in youth and community settings, in early years provision, in schools and colleges, and in adult education. And of course, there are those that work as self-employed, independent researchers too. This point alone is enough of a reason to need to problematise what it means to be an ECR in education. There must be differences between pursuing a research career in HE and pursuing an educational career outside HE, but that also involves research. But how often do we talk about this as an educational research community? How are we supporting ECRs who work outside of HE? How are we talking together about broader, more heterogeneous definitions of educational research careers? I'll admit that so far, the reality of being an ECR in HE seems overwhelmingly depressing for many. And this raises the question of why bother with the academic rat race when it appears that the race is rigged, when not everyone can rise to the top. However, this keynote is not an invitation for people to drop out of the system or to do nothing. Rather, it's inviting us to think about engaging in creating alternatives that involve working together, flattening hierarchies, and sharing resources. Of course, such an approach on its own doesn't change the unequal effects of a neoliberal HE system, but it may allow us to create openings, even if they are small, for the micro, the relational, for surprise, which in turn could create opportunities for joy, connection, creativity and learning. And I, for one, am up for that. Catherine Manathunga, in her 2019 paper, introduces a timescape mapping methodology for doctoral students and their supervisors, which I think could be adapted to allow ECRs and their peers, mentors and managers to engage in playful, suspended time in HE by drawing and representing their life histories and geographies using textual, visual and creative forms, perhaps developing broader, more inclusive career as lifetime project narratives. I'd be interested in seeing if a timescape mapping methodology could be used as a starting point to locate and share researchers' understandings of the impact of time and space on their research journeys and relationships. And it's on my list of things to do to spend more time with a more recent paper by Catherine and her colleagues, which looks at timescape mapping in more detail, along with images of real examples, and that's in the references. So what else can we do? I was inspired by reading the Res Sisters Manifesto from 2017, which seeks to encourage change through collective feminist action. It's a call to arms to support ECRs and other interested academics to counter the pervasive logic of neoliberalism and instead bring us together for positive change. With their manifesto, they move beyond identifying and critiquing the forms of exclusion in HE to offer suggestions for how ECRs might occupy academia differently, adding to the voices of other academics endorsing collective strategies of resistance. The manifesto includes the following actions, which are detailed more in the chapter. Embrace collectivity and welcome and nurture allies. Little acts of solidarity make a big difference. Recognise your power and privilege and use it to more equitable ends. Speak out against discrimination and oppression in academia, especially if you have power and privilege. And self-care is a must. We must strive to live by our politics and values, but this must not come at the cost of our health. So how might we move towards a more socially just approach to career guidance for ECRs? Barry Irving says that career guidance could be practiced as a socially critical practice with the aim of enhancing awareness and understanding of the diverse ways in which life and careers might be meaningfully constructed and enacted. Tristram Hooley and colleagues go further to attempt to link career guidance with collective forms of agency. They argue that career guidance be defined as purposeful learning opportunities which support individuals and groups to consider and reconsider work, leisure and learning in the light of new information and experiences, and to take both individual and collective action as a result of this. They suggest that this could help people to challenge and transcend neoliberal ruling mechanisms. They urge us not to ignore or remain neutral to the challenges of power and context. But how and where could this happen in higher education contexts? Do we need to think about what career education and guidance looks like and should look like for the broad range of ECRs in education? Tristram and colleagues provide 5 signposts towards a socially just approach to career guidance, which may be a useful starting point for our thinking. 1, build critical consciousness. 2, name oppression. 3, question what is normal. 4, encourage people to work together. And 5, work at a range of levels. So while we're processing possible collective next steps, you may be feeling like you want to do something right now. And if you're in a position to do so, one way you can show solidarity with research colleagues in less favourable employment conditions is to donate money to the UCU Fighting Fund. Members can access this fund when they lose earnings through strike action, for example, when striking over falling pay, pay gaps, precarious employment practices, unsafe workloads and pensions. Our colleagues access this fund in emergencies to help cover their housing, food and care costs. So if you want to, you can donate online using the link on the screen. And as I start to bring this keynote to a close, I want us to pause for a moment to consider a quote from Erin Manning's work on the potential power of the minor gesture. She describes the minor gesture as the gestural force that opens experience to its potential variation. It does this from within experience itself, activating a shift in tone, a difference in quality. It is a force that courses through the grand narrative, unmooring its structural integrity, problematizing its normative standards. The minor gesture is out of time, untimely, rhythmically inventing its own pulse. The register of the minor gesture is always political. In its reorienting of the event, it invents new modes of life living. It moves through the event, creating a pulse, opening the way for new tendencies to emerge, and in the resonances that are awakened, potential for difference looms. And I want to end by thinking about the minor gestures we are already enacting in HE and the new ones that might be necessary as we move ahead. So perhaps the end of this keynote can be the beginning of our sharing of examples of acts of collective support and resistance in HE, and particularly examples that speak to the issues raised earlier. I would really like you to share the collective research and/or researcher spaces that you have purposefully created or sustained or been invited to participate in. Tell us what they are, tell us what they look like. No example or act is too small. And let's see if we can flood the BERA 2021 hashtag on Twitter with examples of collective support and resistance in academia. And finally, before I hand back to Mari, let me just show you the reading list that I've put together for those of you who might choose to do some further reading on the back of today. So I want to make sure that these resources are captured by the recording. So here we go. Okay, let's leave it there for now. Over to you, Mari.
Thank you so much, Katy, for that. There has been quite a conversation going on in the discussion, which you won't be able to see at the moment, but very, very positive feedback. Words that have been used of your keynote are powerful and thought-provoking. And Jo has mentioned that she's nodding furiously at the screen all the way through. There's some questions already come in, and I'm going to summarize the first couple actually, because there's been quite a lot of chat about them. So I've sort of summarized them into, Lucy has mentioned, young, this is less true in education with so many crossing over from teaching careers. Do you think that the age profile of education ECRs is older? And if so, does this have implications for career norms? And I'm going to team it with another one from Jo. It's funny to be termed early career as someone who has taught, lectured and written at the ripe old age of 53. Late career researcher, are the experiences of earlier careers ignored within academic pathways? So I thought it was helpful to put those two together.
Okay, so let me start by responding to the last question that you mentioned. You might have to remind me of the first one. But I think that's a really good point. And I know that other organisations have actually moved away from the term early career researcher. So, for example, the Society for Research into Higher Education now talks about the same group of people as newer researchers. And I think that's to recognise that, particularly when we talk about this heterogeneous profile of ECRs in education, to recognise that it's not early career for most of us. It's a second career or third career. And yet there is something important and different about awakening the researcher part of your career that may need additional support and resources. So I think the work of early career researcher groups, networks, organisations are very important, but I agree that sometimes the term can be a little bit, well, not inclusive. And I can't, what was the first question?
The first question was, young, this is less true in education with so many crossing over from teaching careers. Do you think that the age profile of education ECRs is older, I suppose, as a discipline? And if so, does this have implication for career norms?
So for me, this is making me think particularly about Bruce McFarlane and Alison Jefferson's paper, because it's not so much about whether you're later coming into having an academic career or a research career, but it's also about where you're positioned within that system of higher education. So if you're working in a newer post-92 university like me, the fact that you're coming in later, having been a teacher in schools or colleges, is less likely to be seen as a disadvantage. Whereas if you were working in a more elite research-intensive university, you may feel more of a distance between you and the ideal academic subject.
Mm. And I think that's almost reflected. There's a lot of people talking very much that how you have challenged those normative discourses of being an early career researcher has really resonated with them. But then we've had one or two comments from people who've done this straight from undergraduate to postgraduate, straight into academia, who are now beginning to feel slightly marginalized, I think. So I guess it's about accepting that the sort of range of different ways in and then ways of being in research. And one of the delegates has suggested, is interested in whether you think there should be opportunity to self-identify as an early career researcher, particularly considering your comments on, and you know this, I wrote down the rest of your life, but actually it's your life. So I don't know how you feel about that.
So, sorry, I'm just trying to remember the first bit of what you said. So in a nutshell, what was that last question?
Should there be an opportunity to self-identify as an ECR, particularly considering your comments about life experiences that might impact your progression?
Yeah, I think so. I think I would support that, but I'm also thinking about my own trajectory through education. So I just want to speak a little bit to people that now say they might feel a bit marginalized given that they've done the conventional, traditional, smooth, linear route through, because in a way that was my journey. It's just that I didn't, I'd finished a master's, had a baby by surprise, and then went straight into doing a PhD and then have never left. So I do identify with that, but there are differences with the advantages that come with that, depending on, again, what sort of university you work in, what social capital you have with the networks of the established professors and other senior academics. And I suppose for me, it's about recognizing advantage and privilege, not assuming that everyone who identifies as an ECR is the same or has the same access to resources and capital, and finding ways to talk about this so that we can, for me, it's not about that's right and that's a good way and that's wrong and that's a bad way. It's not down to individuals. It's to do with the the structure of the system, but we do have some agency, and I think that's why I'm interested in the the researchers and colleagues that are talking about possibilities for collective action, and for, you know, radical other alternatives. I don't have any solutions, but I think we have. There are enough. I mean, that's why I'm asking people to share. You know, even, you know, if we're talking about reading, you know, inclusive reading groups that people have set up, or what else could it be? Writing retreats, you know, all the different examples where it's not just about putting something on for ECRs, where it's something more organic and involving people from different sorts of institutions at different points in the career course. And I suppose for me, that's what BERA has provided me when the institutions that I've worked for haven't necessarily, which is actually not true for BCU where I currently work, but in other universities, I've felt sometimes like an outsider, marginalised, and BERA has allowed the connection with other like-minded people across the range of universities, and with different levels of experience, and that's been hugely positive and enjoyable.
I think the BERA being that community that you become part of and you feel safe with, and sometimes you can be honest with, is true for many of us who have been involved in BERA over many, many years. And I guess it's that honesty that sometimes is difficult to be with new people.